Join with me today is author Gabriel Rotello. He has quite the interesting book out available for the people who love the world of punk rock, who like history, who like mystery, the CBGB Conspiracy. Gabriel, how you doing?
Hey, Drew, I'm doing good. How are you?
Doing great, man. I appreciate you hopping on the show to talk about this book a little bit. It's a little bit of a mix of real life history, real life experiences based in fiction a little bit. Can you build off that a little bit and kind of explain this book?
Yeah, it's considered to be historical fiction. It's a murder mystery that takes place in downtown New York, on the downtown New York scene in 1977. So it's a fictional murder mystery. The person in the book that gets murdered wasn't a real person, and they didn't actually get murdered. But it's populated by a lot of characters who were real people, people that I knew on the scene in those days. And that's what you do in historical fiction is you mix it up. So there's people like William Burroughs and Jean-Michel Basquiat and Hilly Crystal, the owner of CBGB, and Lou Reed and Roy Cohn and Fat Tony Salerno, all these people that were real people on the scene back then. And then is 1977 in downtown New York. 77 was the year that New York City famously hit bottom. It was the year of the blackout, the great blackout of 1977, in which the city erupted into riots and looting. It was the year of the Son of Sam serial killers. It was the year New York basically went bankrupt. Ford to City dropped dead, as the famous New York Post headline had it. So it was a time that people were fleeing the city by the tens and hundreds of thousands. But for young people like me, in my early 20s, it was a paradise, really, because it was incredibly inexpensive to live there. You could live in Manhattan downtown for, my first apartment was like $100, $90 a month, actually.
Nice.
Yeah. And so the city was filled, jam-packed with kids who wanted to be, in the music scene or the fashion scene or the writing scene or, any of the dancing, acting, all that stuff. It was jam-packed, and that was the genesis of punk rock, of hip hop, of all of the things that came out of New York in that era. So that's the time period in which this murder mystery takes place.
Awesome. Were you around when that club kid scene was going on?
Yes, I knew them very well. Michael Alig was an old friend of mine. I had worked at the Limelight and had sort of run the big shows in the Limelight in the mid 80s. And then Michael and his friends came on right after me. But that's 10 to 15 years after the period that we're talking about in this book. This is the 70s, before any of that stuff happened.
Yeah, New York. You were talking about that scene, and I read Disco Bloodbath back in a long time ago. But
I actually co-produced the documentary called Party Monster.
Oh, okay.
Was the first documentary about the club kids that then gave rise to the movie Party Monster.
Yeah.
That was made based upon the documentary. So I actually was one of the producers of that.
Oh, but that's crazy.
That was even years later.
Right.
All of it had ended.
Needless to say, you've seen some stuff go down in New York City for sure. And all that scene. But back to the novel a little bit. How do you decide how to blend the genres a little bit of bringing fictional characters with real people? You mentioned Patti Smith, Lou Reed. Kind of how do you decide where the history ends and kind of the fiction begins?
It's a real blend. In this particular case, people had asked me for years to write a memoir of my time in the 70s, because I'm always telling stories and people are going, oh my God, you should write a book. And I was always like, I can't really write a book about that period because I'm gay and most of my friends were gay. And in that era, it was just before the AIDS epidemic, and it's going to happen in the 80s, which is that practically everybody's going to get sick and die of this horrible disease. And I just couldn't do that. But the idea just popped into my head. What if I brought them back to life as characters in a fictional story and just focused it on just one particular thing, and it'd be like a fun thing to do rather than a super heavy thing to do. So that blend just was part of the original idea. And then I just got an idea one day walking down the street. What if a young, beautiful poet on the downtown scene, this guy that everybody's in love with, is found dead in his tenement apartment with a heroin needle hanging out of his arm, and the cops think that it's an accidental OD, but his friends don't think so because he didn't really do heroin, and so why would he have OD'd in his apartment? They think that maybe somebody was there with him, maybe somebody even murdered him. So his best friend goes over the next night to the apartment to see if there's any evidence there, and when he arrives in the middle of the night, it's dark, he's in the hallway, there's someone in the apartment, the door opens, and William S. Burroughs comes out and goes hurrying down the hall, and he thinks, oh my God, it was Burroughs, you know. So I loved that. And I thought, okay, that's a great germ for the beginning of a murder mystery. Yeah. But then what do you do with it? And then it was all about who do you bring into it? And I wanted the son of Sam to be in it because that was what was happening in 77. And I wanted the Blackout to play a major role in it. And I also, 77 was the year that Hilly Crystal, who was a very dear friend of mine, who was the owner of CBGB, made the very unwise decision to open a theater that he called the CBGB Theater, a much larger space to fill up the crowds that could no longer get into CBGB's because CB's was too small. And so he opened this thing, and it was a financial disaster for him. The place needed way too much work, and he basically went bankrupt, and he never really financially recovered from that. How could I work that little mini disaster into it too? So it was just all about that. Just how can you fit all of these things into the story? How can you bring in real people and populate it with real people? A lot of it was just remembering what people were like, and how they trying to imagine, you know, how they would react in the situations that I put them in the novel. So it was fun. It was a fun exercise in just, for me, in just like time travel and going back to that time in a fictional way, but going back to that time and really kind of like painting the picture of what that time was like and what those people were like. And it was a great time.
Absolutely. You know, when I was growing up, in high school and everything. So I'm in Wisconsin. I grew up in Wisconsin. And I would see all these people with the CBGB t-shirts on that I think they probably got from Target or Walmart or something like that. And, you know, I started getting into kind of like the punk scene really in high school, my freshman, sophomore year. I kind of knew stuff about it a little bit before, but you know, and then so I started hearing about the CBGB, and they're just like, I asked someone one time, like, what is that? And they're just like, ugh, like get away from me, you fucking poser or whatever. I'm just like, okay. But
that's not nice.
But I know, but everyone like kind of like romanticized CBGB, you know, in the early 2000s for sure. Are, you know, from your experience and you being in the scene when it was the scene, what do people get wrong about CBGB and like their perception of it?
Well, one thing that they get right about it is that it was a really skanky place. I mean, Hilly, it was filthy. It smelled. There was gunk everywhere. The bathrooms were so unbelievable that, you know, I would just go outside and go around the corner to an alley rather than go into the bathroom at CBGB's. Although it had the best sound system in New York. Hilly was a stickler about sound systems, but not about anything. Nice. So it was a great place to play because the sound was fantastic, but it really was horrible. So they get that right about it. But the thing I think that people get wrong often today is that as the years went by, I mean, so CB's basically started the very first, what came to be called punk band, started playing there in 1974, at the end of 74. That was the group Television with Richard Lloyd and Tom Verlaine was the first band. And then very, very quickly, Patti Smith and Talking Heads and Ramones and Blondie, all of whom were completely unknown and just starting out, and quite frankly weren't really very good in the very beginning. You know, Hilly gave people a place to play and to get better, but they were all just starting out. So that was the era that we're talking about. What people in later years, I think, came to associate punk and the word punk with a very particular strain of that, which kind of came from the Ramones and was sort of like loud and fast. And then when the Sex Pistols from the UK came over, that came to be closely associated with punk, and people came to think of punk as almost like hardcore. It was like the precursor of hardcore, and it's this headbanging music, mostly for like young guys, and you're screaming and you can barely play your instruments, etc. And that I think that people do get wrong, because when you think of the original bands, I mean, if you think of Television with Tom Verlaine, there's nothing primitive or angry or nihilistic about that. When you think of Patti Smith, extremely sophisticated. When you think about Blondie, it's like just power pop from top to bottom, just absolutely melodic. Talking Heads, ethereal stuff. So, I mean, the original punk in 74, 75, 76, 77 was this wild blend of really interesting stuff, some of which gave rise to the mosh pits and all that stuff. But that wasn't what it was all about in the beginning. I was attracted to it really from, not to sound pretentious, but from sort of an intellectual perspective. People like Patti Smith, and Talking Heads, they're real poets. Tom Verlaine was a poet. To me they were the successors of the Beats. The Beats in the late 50s and 60s, Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti and all those guys were these wonderful, cool poets that gave rise to the beatniks and all that stuff. And the early punks were the successors, and they were, by the way, friends with those people. And Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs came into CBGBs, even though they were much older by now. In the 70s, Burroughs was in his 60s. But they would come in and they were friends, and Patti Smith would sit at William Burroughs' feet and imbibe his wisdom, So that was the punk that I was interested in. And I do think that that is something that people get a little bit wrong.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, getting somebody that has like firsthand experiences is amazing, because there's all this mystique and everything. And and you're right with punk, at least when I think of it too. I'm 35, so I obviously wasn't around then, but I think of Ramones, I think of Sex Pistols and stuff. I have seen Blondie. I saw Blondie at Riot Fest pre-pandemic, and that was a pretty cool experience to see that. But in that time, 1977, it had to be just super, super interesting. And just I mean, for you, it's probably just, this is normal life, and this is what
I mean, one thing that it did do was that they do kind of get right when they think of it as sort of primitive, is that by the mid 70s, rock had become very bloated. It was stadium oriented. It was very commercial. When you think of groups like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and ELO and all these groups that played in these huge stadiums, played this polished music, and punk was attempting, the CBGB scene was attempting to get back to an earlier era where people could just pick up a guitar and play, or pick up drums. You didn't have to be a virtuoso. What you needed was something to say. You needed a message, like the 60s rockers that were very simple, like the Kinks and people like that. So that was what people were trying to do, and they did do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why it has that reputation, because it was relatively simple, and anybody could aspire to do it. It was like just going down the basement, get a guitar, get a bass player, get some drums, and make some music and have fun. And that was what was great about it. But we had no idea at that time that it would become this legendary thing. I mean, it was a tiny scene in the beginning. There was maybe 100 people that went there all the time, and at least half of them were the musicians who were playing on the other nights. All friends, and you would go see your friends, and they would bring some friends, and then so you got to know absolutely everybody. People are sometimes amazed that when they say you knew all these people. How did you know like all these people? You're friends with Johnny Thunders and Joey Ramone and all that. It's like, no, if you hung out there, everybody was friends with all those people, because it was this tiny, tiny scene. And the idea that 40 years later, or whatever it is, 50 years later, we would be talking about this. And I would write a novel based on it, and people would be freaking out about this novel that takes you back into the world of CBGBs, is just not something that ever crossed our minds at the time.
With the book, was there ever like a point where kind of like your reality and your existence and your experience was stranger than creating a murder mystery in itself?
Well, yeah, I mean, it probably always was on a daily basis. It was, uh, it was a wild, wild time for sure. But I love the process of creating a murder mystery, and I love the process of tying in the Blackout and the Son of Sam and Hilly's CBGB Theater and all of the different people. That was a fascinating exercise, and it was an exercise in not so much nostalgia, but almost like recreation, like really going back, like time travel rather than nostalgia, like going back into it. And I spent months and months just immersed in it, where I could
Yeah.
hardly talk to anybody in the real world. Because if you're not in 1977, I got nothing to say to you. You know,
Right.
people didn't know what I was talking about. And now, when the book finally came out, they read it. They were like, "Oh, that's what was going on. You were really back in there."
Yeah. And so what was your approach then for writing? Like, is it, kind of you kind of start at the end and work backwards?
Yes. Well, for a murder mystery, I think people generally do. I certainly did. I mean, lots of novels, people just begin with an idea and with a couple of characters, and they
Yeah.
just start to see where they go. But with a murder mystery, it has to have a very satisfying ending. You have to find out who done it. It has to make sense, and then you
Mhm.
have to be able to look back through the book and say, "Oh, there were all these clues that were scattered all the way through it, and he deliberately took me down a couple of wild goose chases, but he always had his idea." So for that, you kind of have to start at the end and say, "This is who done it, and this is what it's going to turn out to be," and then sort of work backwards. So you create it like an outline,
Yeah.
basically, which is maybe 5 or 6 pages, kind of like bullet points. Each chapter, this is what's going to happen in this chapter, this is what's going to happen in the next chapter, etc., and whose point of view it's going to be from in each chapter. But then when you start to write it, the characters do take on a life of their own, and things
Mhm.
start to happen that you didn't plot out meticulously, and I just let it happen. And some of the best stuff was that, when you just let the characters and the story just kind of take a turn on its own, and you're surprised too, like, oh my God, I
Right.
can't believe it's going there. So it's a fun process.
Yeah. Were you kind of obviously you were immersing yourself back into 1977, back into your experience in the scene and everything like that, but were you reading other murder mysteries to kind of get an idea of how to do it or just
No, I wasn't reading murder mysteries. I was reading books about New York in the 70s.
okay.
Please kill me, and books about CBGBs and all that stuff. And I'm in some of those books, and I'm not in
Nice.
some of them, and there's a ton of them, and they're really really fun, and they just remind you. You're reading along, and you suddenly go, "Oh my God, Terry Orr." Who was the manager of television? I'd completely forgotten about that guy, and now I remember. That
Yeah.
kind of. But one of my favorite things I did was, there's a documentary that anybody can see on YouTube these days. It's from the early 90s, which is an era that I was making a lot of documentaries for VH1 and places like that. You remember the era of like Behind the Music, and
Yeah.
where there were all these pop culture documentaries. I used to work for World of Wonder, and I made a lot of those documentaries for World of Wonder. And somebody made one, I'm quite sure it was for VH1, called 1977, The Coolest Year in Hell. And it's
All right.
about New York City, the downtown scene in New York in 1977. And it's about the blackout, and it's about the Son of Sam. It's about CBGBs and the rise of punk rock. It's about the rise of hip hop. It's about the blackout, all that stuff. It's 2 hours
Yeah.
long, and it's wall to wall visual footage as the talking heads come on and talk about what was going on, and the narrator is narrating. You're just seeing footage of New York in 1977. And for me, that was just fantastic because, you remember it in your mind, but you don't necessarily remember what you were wearing,
Right.
what cars looked like that particular year, or
Yeah.
what ads were on TV, or, that kind of thing. And this documentary had it all. So I just kept that over in the corner on a laptop. And just whenever I needed a little inspiration, I would watch that for 5 minutes, and that would charge me up again
That's
to
awesome.
back into the 70s.
Yeah, that is wild. It is, even now, like in the world of reels and all that kind of stuff, I'll stumble upon a video from, can you believe this commercial was around in 1990? And then you're like, oh my God, I remember watching that on TV. I remember where I was then. And like, I was eating a bowl of cereal or something like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
it is crazy how just like stuff like that can just suck you back into a moment in time or a distant memory that now you just remember vividly. It's
Yeah, it's like smells do that sometimes. So you ever
yeah,
smell something and suddenly you're like, "Oh my God, I remember when I was like 8 years old at summer camp," or something like that. So visuals can do the same thing, and it's very powerful. And I was just very grateful that that documentary existed, because where else would you get? You'd have to, try to collect little bits of footage
yeah.
on YouTube. Good luck with that. So that was very helpful.
Awesome. Yeah, that's definitely something I'll have to check out. And um not necessarily related to CBGB or anything, but I think I watched a documentary, How to Survive a Plague. I don't know if you've watched that one. And I think that took place in New York too, a little bit too, with all that you mentioned before, like the AIDS epidemic. And
Yeah.
it was just to be aware of all that stuff that's going on in the world, on top of the glamorization of the cities and all that kind of stuff too, and kind of getting like the truth between everything that's going on is I think impactful, and it's unique, and pieces of history that like people really need to kind of like learn about and hear
Yeah,
about, which is great.
absolutely. It's great that you mentioned that particular documentary. I was a member of ACT UP. That documentary was primarily about the group ACT UP, and I was a member. I joined ACT UP right at the beginning of ACT UP, and all of the folks in that documentary were friends of mine,
Okay.
um, and in that period. And I started the Out Week magazine right at that period too. And that documentary really shows. It doesn't just take you back in time, but it also shows you how people can make a difference, how direct
Yeah.
action can actually change things in an incredibly positive way. Because when ACT UP started, AIDS was just an absolute death sentence. Everybody who got it was going to die. It
Yep.
was a matter of when, and it wasn't going to be pretty. And by 9 years later, 8 years later, whatever it was, and largely thanks, or significantly thanks to the work of activists in ACT UP, the government fast-tracked drugs, and AIDS stopped being a death sentence. And so it was a very successful movement. And I love it that young people watch that documentary, and I hope that they're inspired by it, because we
Yeah.
certainly need direct action right now as much
Yeah.
as we ever had. And if people can get inspired by that and believe that they can make change, then that's good. But again, from my perspective, that was all way
Yeah.
later, and that was the reason I didn't want to write a memoir, was because it would delve into that. And unfortunately for me and for most of my friends, most people died of it for
Yeah.
15 years before they finally came up with these drugs. So yeah.
Yeah. It was a great documentary, but yeah, seeing, being someone who hasn't experienced all that, it's like, to me, like the 70s and the 80s are all the same, but obviously but
No, 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 no. Literally, there's 1981 is the dividing line. If you were, my generation,
yeah.
I'm 73 years old now. I came to New York in 1974 when I was 21 years old. So in 77, when
Mhm.
the book happens, I would have been 21 or 25 years old. And for those of us who lived through that,
Right.
there's a sharp dividing line between before AIDS, before 1981, and after AIDS, after 1981. And it's like night and day.
Yeah.
Before AIDS, like carefree, wild, sexual revolution, drugs, gonna live forever. Everybody
Yeah.
having fun. I don't care whether you're disco or you're punk rock or you're hip hop or you're rock and roll or whatever you are. It was like a wild time. And then 81, and then boom, the boom came down. And things continued going on. I was doing those huge Limelight shows in the mid 80s in New York, and there were, all of this stuff was still going on, but the atmosphere was totally different, and everything just chilled, and horribly. And then people began dying
Yeah.
in huge numbers. And when you look at in the arts, in music, in poetry, and everything, the number of people that we lost in the 80s, young,
Right.
not losing people like we just lost somebody who's 80 years old, some old rock and roller. It's like, well, it's terrible. This keeps happening now for
Yeah.
that first generation of rock and roll. But people are old, but these people were young, so
Yeah.
it was a completely different thing. So no, do not confuse the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, I'll do better at that. I'll try to. But yeah, it just an experience. I feel like I could talk to you a lot about just your upbringing, because being a Midwest kid growing up in Wisconsin, it's very different. And but it's good to have these experiences, and good to have these perspectives, and even good to write the murder mystery about it, even though murder isn't great, but everyone loves a good old murder mystery that's based and rooted in actual history. How much would you say of you is kind of hidden in the characters throughout your book?
Well, there is a character in the book that's based on me.
Okay.
So there's one character that actually is me, although I don't call him me. But I would say that it's like kind of a mixture. I mean, I think that whenever you write, you're really writing out of your brain, and so everything that you're writing has a major part of you because you're writing it. But my goal with the characters was with people like William Burroughs and Hilly Crystal and Johnny Thunders and Holly Woodlawn and Truman Capote and all the people that are in the book, was just to try to remember them as much as I possibly could, and then really try to get into their brains and figure out, like, what would they have done, and how would they have spoken, and how would they have acted in the situations that I put them in. So I was trying to sort of get out of my mind and get into the minds of old friends of mine, most of whom passed away many, many years ago.
Yeah.
And one of the most heartening things that I hear from people who have read it, who are from that era and who were there then, is somebody will call up and say, "Oh my God, I can't believe how you nailed Burroughs. I mean, when Burroughs talks in your book, it sounds just like him." Or, Holly Woodlawn, it's like you completely nailed the way that she. And I mean, to me, that's like the biggest compliment, to say that they hear those people again, sort of coming back to life. So I hope that I did that. But for people that never knew those people, I suppose that doesn't really matter, does it? It's just sort of like their characters in a book. So whatever.
People could always go and you know research a little bit more and learn about it, and then make the connection. So that would be important.
That's true. And in the modern age of YouTube, you can actually Google some of those people.
Yeah.
Find bits and pieces of them at some party or talking or giving an interview or something like that, and go, "Oh, there's William Burroughs, and there he's actually talking." And when I was a kid, you couldn't do that. There was no such thing as that. The only people that were preserved were movie stars, and they were preserved in movies speaking lines. You could see Betty Davis and Clark Gable, and they were now really old or dead, but there they still were alive on the movie screen. But we were not able to Google, or to YouTube people from cool people from the 1920s, and, oh, look, there's Gertrude Stein, hanging out with Picasso and whatever. They didn't exist, and now it does exist. So it's for young people, it's like a whole different thing.
Absolutely. If you could, if you were to make like a playlist to kind of coincide with this book, what are kind of your top songs or artists? Obviously, you've mentioned some of them before, but who would you have on that playlist?
I would say that it would have to include the album Horses by Patti Smith. Patti Smith was the first person signed out of the CBGB's scene, and Horses was her first album, and it's a masterpiece. I would say that it would have to be the Ramones' first album.
Yeah.
That was actually the first album to come out from the CBGB scene. Patti got signed first. The Ramones got signed second, but they made their album much faster, and it came out. Patti was working with Clive Davis, who, by the way, just passed away 2 days ago. And it was a much longer and more arduous process for her to make that album, so it came out second. But I would say those two. I would say that television's first and greatest album would be very, very high on the list. Marquee Moon, it's called, and that is also a masterpiece. Those are just three masterpieces right there. I mean, all three of those albums, if listeners are not aware of them, get yourself a copy of Horses by Patti Smith and just sit down. Don't do anything. Don't be doing errands. Don't be, walking around. Just sit down, put your headphones on, or if you have a good sound system, and just listen to that with the lyrics in front of you, beginning to end, and it will blow you away. I mean, it's still to this day. It's one of the classics of all time. Talking Heads, same thing. All of their first albums, even Blondie's first album. Blondie didn't actually hit until I think their third album. But then they became, in the end of the 70s and beginning of the 80s, Blondie was like Beyonce, just like this gigantic superstar on the cover of in the grocery store, the checkout line, those magazines.
Mm-hmm.
People, it was like Blondie, Blondie, Blondie. They became literally gigantic international superstars after their third album. But their first album is really, really good, and it's raw, and you really get where they were coming from. So there were so many. Richard Hell and the Voidoids. I think for more people, that's more of an acquired taste. If you're more into sort of what then became hardcore stuff. Richard Hell and the Voidoids would be another good choice. But there's so many. And when you think about the amount of music that came out of CBGBs, the amount of bands, I mean, there's never been anything like it. There's never been in the history of rock and roll or the history of anything, a single club from which so many big, hugely important stars emerged. There was in the 50s, there were some jazz clubs, like on 52nd Street in New York, and, famous places where all these famous people played, but they were all people that had become famous, generally speaking, someplace else. And then they would come to New York and they would play at the Blue Note, or they would play at the Village Vanguard, or they would play someplace like that. But for a club that just started with local talent in the neighborhood, basically people living in the East Village, which for people who don't know New York, it's just this tiny neighborhood below 14th Street, the downtown scene, to spawn so many just incredibly influential acts in such a short period of time. It's just unprecedented. It's never happened before. And a big reason for that was Hilly Crystal. I mean, a big reason for it was the times that we were living in, the fact that New York was a magnet, the fact that it was super cheap and you could come there without a business plan, without any money, $50 in your pocket and just rent a cheap thing. Part of it was that, but part of it was Hilly Crystal himself, who the owner of CBGB, who had this philosophy that he wanted to give kids a chance that he thought was good. He had a very discerning ear. He was actually a jazz person originally, but he had a very discerning ear. And if he liked you, instead of just letting you play there once every few weeks on a Thursday night or whatever, he would give you a residency, and he would let you play like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday for 6 weeks. And what would happen is that in the beginning of those 6 weeks, that the particular band, like Television, for example, wouldn't be very good. It wouldn't be that great. But at the end of the 6 weeks, it would be a total transformation, because there's no better form of rehearsal than playing in front of a live audience.
Right.
Like 1 minute of playing in front of a live audience is like 2 hours of just being in some garage someplace playing for yourselves, because you have to get it together. There's people out there, listening.
Right.
And so you start to gel, and it starts to happen. And Hilly gave people that opportunity. And that played, I think, a gigantic role in what then subsequently happened with all those people, which is that they became really good. Because when I first started going, nobody was really good. I mean, Patti Smith was super interesting from the very, very beginning. And the Ramones were hilarious from the beginning, because it was just like 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, 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 blah. Like nobody had ever heard it. But even they weren't very good. But everybody else basically sucked. I mean, Talking Heads were terrible. Blondie was terrible. I mean, they just were not very good. And within a year or so of being given that chance at CBGBs, they got good. And they wouldn't have had that chance if it wasn't for Hilly. So I give him credit, and I think that they all give him the credit too. I mean, he was a wonderful person, a real sweetheart, and an amazing discoverer of talent, but then a nurturer of talent as well.
Awesome. The book, The CBGB Conspiracy, where can the people get a hold of it, and how can they kind of see what you got going on?
They can get a hold of the book any place fine books are sold, or online, barnesandnoble.com or Amazon, whatever you want. It's all over the place. I am on Instagram. I have my website, which is gabrielrotello.com. I have to admit that as an old fogey, I'm not, super into social media. I'm not online every day posting stuff and all that kind of thing like the kids do today. But I'm on there, and you can just Google the CBGB Conspiracy and you'll see all sorts of stuff about it. People have given it wonderful reviews, and it's been reviewed in wonderful papers and magazines, and it's been fun.
Awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on and giving me some history and giving me some lessons. And the book is fun, and I just appreciate you coming on, reaching out. It's been a great talk, man.
Great, Drew. Thanks talking to you. Nice talking to you too. Thanks.